Okay, we're going to get started. I'm still Richard Haass, and more important, we've got Niall Ferguson up here with me. He is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is the author of more books than most of us have read, but most recently, The Square and the Tower. And he is what we used to call, and probably still should, a public intellectual. And he is someone who is helping to shape the debate, not just in my own country, but around the world, about the world. And he's a perfect example of a historian who tries to bring history to bear on the present. Now, what we're going to do today is push him a little bit and try to bring history to bear, not just on the past and the present, but on the future. We'll go at it for a few minutes, and then we will open it up, and each one of these sessions runs for just under half an hour. This is the first of three. So Niall, thank you for being here. People who observe tumultuous times like the one we live in are always looking for comparisons, handles, understandings. So what is it we should grab, and what is it we should be careful of grabbing? What for you, where do we go for guidance, and where are people perhaps going that is more misleading than illuminating?
Well, thank you, Richard. And let me take this opportunity to thank Victor Pinchuk and his entire team for the invitation to be here once again at this extraordinarily important conference. You may well wonder what business a historian has talking about the future. Isn't that what futurologists do, and shouldn't historians stick to the past? But it was Winston Churchill who said, the further back you look, the further forward you can see. And I'm certainly of the view that historians have a vital role to play in helping us understand the present and the possible futures that we face, because there is only one past, but multiple futures. And our job, collectively, is to choose the right future. I think of myself as an applied historian. In some ways, I've been influenced in that regard by someone we both know well, whose biography I'm writing, Henry Kissinger. And I think Kissinger's career illustrates the power of history when it comes to assessing contemporary strategic dilemmas. So let me answer your question, Richard, with an observation. I am very struck by how often journalists and politicians resort to a bad analogy when they're trying to understand our time. And that analogy is with the 1930s. I wish I had a Bitcoin for every bad op-ed I've read in the last 10 years saying that it's the 1930s all over again. 10 years ago, in the financial crisis, any number of economists were predicting a second Great Depression. Fast forward 10 years, and every time a populist party does well in an election, we're told that it's the rise of fascism, it's the 1930s all over again. And I think this is a completely unhelpful analogy. Number one, we didn't rerun the Great Depression, in case you hadn't noticed. And number two, populism is not fascism, and it's a profound category error to confuse the two. So if we're looking for analogies, could we please leave the 1930s alone? It's an overused analogy, and it actually has got many people into a good deal of trouble in the past.
Does anything work better, or for reasons that you will articulate, is the present some sui generis? Is this because of technology, because of the people on the scene, whatever reasons? Is this a qualitative, is this something of a departure from history that has to be seen that way? Or do you find some other periods of history actually is quite useful as a framing?
I think, and I now live very near Silicon Valley, so I I have good reason to say this. I think people who work in the information technology business are very inclined to tell you that they have made the world anew and all previous experience is no longer relevant. History began with the Google IPO, and everything before that was the Stone Age. And I think this is completely misleading. In reality, technology is a less powerful driver of historical change than most people in Silicon Valley appreciate.
Might be because so few of them have read history.
Well, I know Mark Zuckerberg did not take my Harvard history course before he dropped out, and he is paying the price for that omission today. But let me throw out an analogy which I think is more illuminating. We have had periods when communications technology changed very rapidly and unleashed disruption before. In fact, there's a very good parallel between the impact of the personal computer and the internet and the impact of the printing press when it first began to spread through Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. I think this analogy is much more interesting than the kind of analogies that we usually hear, which are nearly always from the mid-20th century. Mid-20th century information technology was very centralized or centralizable. The telegraph, the telephone, the radio, the cinema, all of these things were very easy to control centrally. And that's one reason that totalitarian states were possible in the middle of the 20th century. What's interesting about the printing press, and the reason it resembles the personal computer and the internet, is that it decentralized communication very radically. It greatly increased the volume of communication and information, and it lowered the price dramatically in a way very similar to our own time. So the analogy in The Square and the Tower, my most recent book, which you kindly mentioned, is between the 16th and 17th century and our own time. Because I think that the internet is having a very similar effect on political and indeed religious stability as the printing press had on the religious stability of Europe in the 16th and 17th century. And this is a pretty worrying analogy when you think about its implications.
So let me follow up in two ways. One is you talked about the decentralization of technology. I remember when the Arab Spring broke out 7 years ago, a lot of observers said this technology is liberating and essentially it favors individuals against governments. Move ahead 7 years later, the Arab Spring has turned into an Arab winter, and we look around the world. We look at greater repression in China. We look at greater repression in Russia. We look at illiberalism in Eastern Europe. We look at the former democracy in Turkey. We look at what's going on in the Philippines. So why is it we have this seeming contradiction between diffused technology that empowers individuals and in some ways the reassertion of state power?
This is a great question, and you're asking it, Richard, at a time of growing pessimism about the political implications of the internet. In the most recent issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian, has a very pessimistic piece essentially saying that artificial intelligence means that the surveillance state will triumph and democracy will fail. And I think this is becoming conventional wisdom. It's interesting how quickly, as you've just pointed out, our conventional wisdom changes. It really does seem only yesterday that Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen was saying that the internet was going to overthrow dictatorships, not only in the Middle East and North Africa. One explanation for this is that the internet went from being decentralized to being centralized really quickly. And what very few people foresaw, certainly in the 1990s, was that network platforms, beginning with Amazon, then Google, and then, of course, Facebook, would so rapidly centralize the traffic on the internet. That, I think, came as a surprise, certainly a shock to someone like Tim Berners-Lee, who designed the World Wide Web in the hope of creating a very decentralized, distributed network. So I think one reason that authoritarian regimes have been able to bounce back has been that it's been easier to control the internet as a result, and to influence the internet as a result of the emergence of these big central platforms. And one last point, in China, things developed in a way that almost nobody foresaw. Remember Bill Clinton saying that when the Chinese tried to regulate the internet, it would be like nailing Jell-O to a wall. Well, guess what? They nailed Jell-O to the wall. They kept the American technology companies out. They allowed their own technology companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, to grow to the point that they are the only rivals to the big American tech companies. And then they ensured that any data, any of the big data acquired by these companies, was available on demand to the Communist Party. So the big question, which future historians will have to figure out, is whether or not this represents a victory for the whole 20th century project of the totalitarian state. Remember Orwell's 1984. In the 1984 nightmare, the telescreen is on the wall of your apartment, and it sees you and what you do whenever you're there. But we have a portable telescreen that keeps us under constant surveillance, and we volunteer our personal data to this telescreen. Now, Harari and others argue that this is going to be the moment of victory for the totalitarian project. And I am not sure that I'm persuaded. In fact, I think this will turn out to be another of those wrong hypotheses that future historians look back on and say, ha, do you remember those people who thought that the Chinese were going to triumph and that democracy was going to collapse? I think future historians will tell a rather different story. I'll give you a clue as to why I think that. Creativity is the key. If the Chinese regime is successful in turning the internet into a vast engine of surveillance, the first thing that will happen is that free thought, free speech, and therefore creativity will die in China. I already see this happening. My friends at Chinese universities report a dramatic chilling of the temperature. So if you have a surveillance state, yes, you will know everything that your citizens do and maybe even what they say. But as a consequence, their creativity will fundamentally be impeded. Some people here are old enough to remember the Soviet Union. This country was once part of the Soviet Union. There's a reason that the Soviet Union didn't invent the internet. As I was researching the Square and the Tower, I discovered that there had been an institute of cybernetic research here in Kiev. And it was supposed to develop a Soviet internet with peer-to-peer computer communication. It was killed off by the Ministry of Finance in Moscow, which is why the article I read about this called it the Internet.
Not bad.
That's the problem with the surveillance state. That's the problem with total central control. It kills off creativity and innovation. So I am not as pessimistic as Harari, and I think individual liberty is still a pretty powerful application that the human species has on its side.
Well, in some ways you've answered what was going to be my next question is, you're not a technology determinist. You actually think ideas and people will ultimately drive history more than technology.
I do. I mean, artificial intelligence is now better at playing chess than human beings. But could AlphaGo, or for that matter, the company DeepMind, come up with a game better than chess? And that's a different thing. So we, I fear, are slipping into a certain excess reverence for the wonders of information technology, and we're underestimating the unique power
want me to ask
of the brain of Homo sapiens. I've been trying to counter the negative impact of social media on my life by listening again to the plays of Shakespeare. And as I listen my way through the audio productions of Shakespeare, I'm very struck by the universal truths about the human condition that Shakespeare's plays illuminate. One can understand all the dilemmas of all the characters in those plays, despite the vast time that separates us from them. And I keep coming back to the thought that no matter what we may do with information technology, and no matter how powerful computers may become, the fundamental driver of human history is the human condition, is the human brain. When we, and you and I both study this closely, when we study the international system, when we try to understand the workings of power, we in fact are using concepts that date back all the way to Thucydides. You can change the technology all you like, but there are certain constants in human history, and especially in the realm of power.
You and I have something in common, which is we were both on the faculty at Harvard. And one of the courses I co-taught for a while was on the, not just the use, but misuse of history. And since you've mentioned Thucydides twice, let's turn to that. One of the quote-unquote laws of history is the likelihood, if not inevitability, of friction or conflict between the great power of the day and the would-be great power of the day. It's obviously used a lot about the United States and China. How impressed are you by this analogy and its relevance for today?
Well, we are both friends of Graham Allison, whose book, Destined for War, has made the case most compellingly that history expects, though not with absolute certainty, history expects a conflict between the United States and China because on most occasions, this is Allison's argument, on most occasions in the past, when a rising power has challenged an incumbent power, there has been war. Now, it's very important that it's not all cases. And it's also important that Graham selects a sample of cases that I might be inclined to question because there do seem to be some apples and pears in the sample. The biggest exception to the story is, of course, the Cold War. Because if the Thucydides trap was right, there really should have been a Third World War. And yet it never happened. And in reality, the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, with the very unexpected disintegration of the Soviet Empire and then the Soviet Union itself. So when I think about the relationship between the United States and China, I keep reminding myself of how the Cold War turned out. I'm old enough to remember how few people anticipated the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the disintegration 2 years later of the Soviet Union. Almost nobody who was paid to study the Soviet system anticipated that outcome. The few people who did were regarded as somewhat eccentric for predicting it. In history, there are, to use Nassim Taleb's phrase, black swans. There are things which ex ante most people attach a very low probability to. And then they happen, and then everybody retrospectively predicts them. The financial crisis was like that. Hardly anybody saw what was going to happen, but after it happened 10 years ago, everybody rushed to say how they had seen it coming. China is a bit like this. We are all now under the strong impression that Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping, if not Mao Zedong. And we are all completely in awe of China's economy and now also of China's technology companies. And my suspicion is that history is going to play a big trick on us again. And the black swan is going to be a China crisis that is going to surprise us because we all had come to the view that artificial intelligence plus the Chinese Communist Party equals world domination. I think there's no Thucydides trap here because I don't think China is remotely close to being able to challenge the United States in war. And long before it gets to that point, I think the Chinese system is going to run into very serious trouble. Number one, the demographics, the working population shrinks rapidly from now until the end of the century. Two, the excessive debt that has built up as the system has struggled to maintain growth above 6%. So my inclination is to bet against the China model and to make a contrarian bet that crazy old democracy, apparently dysfunctional Washington, is going to turn out to still have the superior model for all the flaws of you-know-who.
I actually think you may be 50% right there. I think you're right to question the brittleness of China. I think people underestimate, it's almost the opposite of India. Whereas India may not succeed big, but it also won't fail big. China, if it doesn't succeed big, is likely to fail big. I think the question for democracies, particularly our own, is whether they could also fail slowly, and that the alternative is not to a centralized world is not the success of democracy, but it's the success of neither, which is more my theory of the future, which is not so much that one or another constellation of group or countries or ideas triumph, but we actually live in a universe that's just far messier because no one quite figures it out.
I think one of the things that I keep coming back to is that the United States is very frequently convinced that it is in terminal decline. It was true in the 1970s. The sense of crisis as the Vietnam War went horribly wrong, as Watergate unfolded, was deeper, I think, even than the sense of crisis that we have in the United States today. Certainly, the civil unrest in American cities in the late 60s and early 70s was worse. And then the United States bounced back, and in the 1980s seemed unassailably strong. At the moment, most commentators in Europe, and I think it's true in much of the American press, are obsessed with the personal idiosyncrasies of you-know-who, of the president.
We've almost gone an entire half an hour without mentioning his name.
I'm not mentioning him. It's like Harry Potter. You're not supposed to mention Voldemort's name, and you shouldn't mention you-know-who, the president's name, because if you mention it, then the conversation becomes about him, and only him. And the key to understanding the American system is it's not a monarchy. The president's powers circumscribed by the Constitution and also by the bureaucracy, which isn't in the Constitution but clearly circumscribes it. I keep trying to remind my more panic-stricken friends, which party controls the majority of the biggest cities in the United States of America? It's the Democratic Party. Which party is almost certain to win back the House in November at the midterm elections? It's the Democratic Party. As far as I can see, the Founding Fathers got this right. They knew that someone like you-know-who would become president. They talked about it a good deal. Alexander Hamilton wrote that a demagogue would almost certainly become president at some point. That's why they designed the Constitution, to limit the power of the executive branch. And it's working. So chill. The system is working better than you realize. The trouble is you're focusing obsessively on the personality of you-know-who. But he's not the king. He's just the president.
We've got about 45 seconds left. I'm getting all sorts of hand signals. Let me ask you about one other phenomenon, because you spent so much of your time in the United Kingdom, which is Brexit. And what your sense is of looking at the past, the future of that country and the future of Europe. Is the European experiment just experiencing a hiccup? Or do you think, again, we're seeing something that could be more fundamental?
I arrived just in time to hear the last few exchanges between you and President Poroshenko, and I heard him describe Ukrainians as the great optimists about Europe. Well, we're the great pessimists about Europe. Britain is so pessimistic that it decided to leave. Turned out to be a little harder to leave than perhaps some proponents of Brexit had led us to expect, but it still seems likely that Britain will leave. And again, a huge excitement surrounds this issue. Perhaps it's not excitement now, it's kind of depressed, frustrated preoccupation. But I think future historians will say that Brexit is just a footnote to the wider problem of European disintegration. Now, this is not something that people here will want to hear, but my sense is that Europe's problems are bigger than most Europeans want to face. Number one, Europe failed to manage the financial crisis. Number two, it made a mess of the Arab revolutions. And number three, it has made an epic mess of the migration crisis of 2015-16. The populist backlash against Europe is a perfectly intelligible one, and I'm afraid it ain't over. And its ultimate destination, I think, is to paralyze, if not to reverse, the process of European integration.
Neil Ferguson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have, let me just welcome to the stage Gillian Tett of the best newspaper in the world, the Financial Times, and Bill Ford, who oversees the extraordinarily talented boutique private equity company, General Atlantic.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Richard, for that nice comments, and thank you for that fascinating discussion. And we've heard a lot this morning about issues of geopolitics and history. We're now going to turn to the topic of money, or more specifically, what one of the smartest investors is currently thinking about the world, about where to put your money, where the opportunities are, where the pitfalls are, and what that means for Ukraine in particular. Bill Ford is CEO of General Atlantic, one of the biggest private equity groups in the world. I think you have 35 billion of assets, Capital. Is that right? Yeah. Right, well, 35 billion is a lot of money. So I'd like to start by asking you, when you look at the world today, when you look at the opportunities, when you look at some of the big changes, what do you think is the key theme of our age?
Great. Well, thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Victor, for having me here. I think two of the most important themes that we're investing against is one, the global transition to a digital economy, which is continuing apace at varying speeds and by country and by sector, but it is happening. And a lot of our investment strategy is predicated on that. There's, maybe just pausing on that for a minute, there's two big themes under that, which is one, moving from the era of connectivity and the internet into the era of data and artificial intelligence, machine learning, which we can maybe come back to. But theme one, digital transition. The second big theme is really the shift of economic growth towards the emerging markets, and particularly Asia, where you're going to see an exponential growth in the middle class and spending power. And that will impact businesses around the world. And it's India, China, Southeast Asia, and a middle class that is expected to grow globally from 3 billion to 5.5 billion. And the spending changes that relate to that.
So for somebody like you, when you look at the globe and you look at these two incredibly disruptive forces, both a shift towards big data and the shift geographically away from the developed world to what's still sometimes wrongly called the emerging markets, how do you factor that into tangible investment decisions? What does that mean for you when you decide where to put your investment money?
Well, when we evaluate emerging markets or countries around the world, we think about several factors as a baseline to really attract capital. One is rule of law and manageable corruption. I think you need that base of property rights to really expose capital to a new environment, the ability to get capital into a country, to get capital out of a country as a global investor. The second is macroeconomic stability, really led by independent central banking. When you have that, you have the preconditions for economic success. One of the things as a global investor is issues like inflation, currency volatility, interest rate volatility are really anathema to successful investing. So we pay very close attention to macro factors and central banks. A lot of the person I most want to meet when I'm traveling to an emerging market is the head of the central bank.
Right.
And lastly, physical security, which many of us in the West take for granted. But physical security, the ability to move in and out of a country, to deploy your people there, matters a lot. And so I always see that as kind of the baseline. With those conditions in place, we can enter a country and do what we do really ever in the world, is seek out entrepreneurs who are driving change and creating opportunity, just like they are here in Ukraine.
Right. Well, I'm going to come back and ask you in a moment about what that means, about your views on Ukraine as an investment opportunity. But before I do, let's step back to the world more broadly. How much of your money right now as an American private equity firm, how much of your money is inside America and how much is outside America?
Well, today we have a portfolio of about 80 companies with a value of about $20 billion, and just under 50% is in the U.S. and 50% is outside the U.S. 20 to 25% in Europe and about 35% in emerging markets. And we've been active for roughly 2 decades in India, China, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So
and is that balance changing? Are you putting more out of America, or are you looking at America as sort of a beacon of growth? Because one of the things that's very striking about the last few years, looking at it from an economic perspective, is that we have seen synchronized global growth. That's really quite unusual by the standards of economic history. But we've also seen America growing particularly fast.
Yeah, we're looking for growth and innovation, and the U.S. continues to be an economy, despite its scale, that's growing 3% plus right now, and still an incredible center of innovation, of course in technology, but also in life sciences, where the leading life sciences companies are now really coming out of the U.S. But there's other centers of innovation in the world, and that's really the track we've been on for 30 plus years at General Atlantic, is to find those centers of entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think China, no doubt, has emerged as a true rival to the U.S. in innovation in really all areas, in R&D spending, et cetera.
But we just heard Neil say that, yes, China has dazzled many people in the West with its growth. Many people in America, and we both live in New York, spend a lot of time fretting about whether China is going to outshine the U.S. in the future. And yet, as Neil says, there are vulnerabilities. When you look at the Chinese economy today, are you concerned about those potential vulnerabilities, the fragilities, or do you expect that growth to continue?
We've been bullish on China, and it's paid off for us, and we remain quite bullish on China. But Neil makes some very good points. We're investing entirely in the private sector. We've avoided the state-owned enterprises and anything really related to the government. I would say, though, having been active there since the mid-90s, the quality of entrepreneurship, the quality of innovation in the private sector is as strong as I've ever seen, and rivals in many areas what you'd see in Silicon Valley.
Fascinating. So you've got the creativity coming through that you see, at least.
Well, they have a number of things going for them. They have I put politics aside. That's Neil and Richard's expertise. They have a very pro-business government. They want national champions. They want global leaders. And so they're in many ways a pro-business government. You start there. Tremendous human capital that they continue to invest in. Last year, 1.7 million STEM graduates versus 900,000 in the U.S. So the base of talent is there. A very robust private equity and venture capital market, stimulating innovation. And something that the U.S. enjoyed for many, many years, a very large home market. Yeah. You think for a minute, you've got 1 billion mobile internet users, 1 billion people on WeChat. You have a great home market to basically develop your business before you even think about going global. And candidly, a government policy that has really excluded global competitors. I mean, think how wonderful it would be to have the biggest internet market in the world and not have to face Google, Amazon, or Facebook. Yes. Which is what the benefit those companies have had for a long time.
But of course, the fact it has excluded global competitors is precisely why we're now looking at a potential trade war, or one of the reasons. Are you concerned that when you look at China and when you look at global growth more broadly, that trade wars could derail some of this optimistic outlook?
Most of the companies we're investing in are really taking advantage of domestic growth. I mean, to the extent domestic growth was impacted, that would be negative for investing in China. I'm more of an optimist that it will get resolved. The bigger area that has always worried me about China has been theft of intellectual property. I think the trade things will be managed over time, but there continues to be a real track of taking IP from the world, and that really hasn't abated. And I hope in the discussion around the trade war we really focus enough on IP protection. But again, the quality of it's remarkable to see the improvement in management talent and quality of entrepreneurship in China over the last 20 years.
Right, that's very interesting. More widely, when you look at the world and try and work out where to put your investments and see where business trends are going, are you feeling optimistic that this global growth can continue, or do you see risks from the trade war? Are you concerned that as central banks try to take all the money out of the system or take out some of the quantitative easing, that's going to slow down the pace of growth?
Well, I'm optimistic in this way. I think the trend towards globalization and innovation around technology of all types is positive for global growth and will continue despite some of these issues. I think the biggest risks are really around government and geopolitical mistakes, macroeconomic mistakes. One thought that I've had, again, I'm not a government person, is if you look at governments around the world, democratic and non-democratic governance, they've not done a particularly good job of addressing the world's problems. And when I step back as a private investor and I think about issues like climate change, educational access, immigration, these are global problems that need to be addressed by government. They're not doing a very good job dealing with it. And so I think the risk is more geopolitical right now than anything else, and a geopolitical mistake. And whether, I mean, I was talked about by Richard and Neil, can the ascendancy of China happen in a peaceful way as it moves to become the largest economy in the world in the next decade? I think generally if the ascendancy of China is peaceful and managed well by the U.S. and Europe, we can have a very prosperous future with good economic growth and great investment opportunities. And of course, if it's managed poorly, whether it's actual conflict or just significant trade barriers, it will have a less prosperous world.
Well, that's a very, very big if.
Yeah.
But what about India? Because as we just heard in the previous discussion, India doesn't look as if it's going to boom as dramatically as China, but perhaps the risks of a failure are less worrying.
Yeah, I think Richard's right when he talked about, it may not soar as high, but it probably won't crash as badly. We're very optimistic about India. We've been investing there since the late 90s. And I think it's growing now at 7%. It's had a wonderful last 4 or 5 years under President Modi. And I think it's a wild card. I mean, it could be, it's the largest democracy in the world, growing nicely now, tremendous potential, but also significant issues that need to be addressed. The issue of, education and pushing education down, a very messy democracy, the need for significant infrastructure spending. If, on the optimistic side, if those issues get addressed, this country could grow at 7% for years and create tremendous investment opportunities. And we're lined up against those in areas like financial services, the consumer, as well as technology. Now, if they don't address those issues, and the prior government really stalled out on that, economic growth won't be there and opportunity won't be there. So, but we're cautiously optimistic and have a quite active business there.
But I mean, more broadly, when you look around the world, are you concerned that we could be heading for another emerging market crisis? I mean, we're already looking at Argentina and Turkey in some trouble. I saw Christine Lagarde a couple of days ago in Washington, who pointed out that if the trade rhetoric escalates, that could certainly hurt the emerging markets. I mean, are you preparing for an emerging markets crisis?
I don't think it's going to be as catastrophic as the last few emerging market crises, but this one does rhyme if you look at it. I mean, it's all about external funding problems. It's dollar borrowing by emerging countries once again, in countries that have large current account deficits, and then getting off track on their central banking, and then creating a real fear among investors, and that cascades on itself. It does appear right now that it's staying relatively contained to Turkey and Argentina. I mean, there have been currency impacts in India and Indonesia, but those countries are actually in quite good shape on a relative basis. So again, I don't mean to be the eternal optimist, but I have a sense that it's not going to cascade the way the last ones did.
Do you have investments in Turkey or Argentina? And if so, what are you doing about it?
Well, we're not active in Turkey and Argentina, and as you and I talked about, we had been very successful investors in Turkey, and we're very bullish on it given its long-term growth and very strong demographics, a large country, 70 million plus people. But really over the last few years, we've pulled back significantly, really because of the issues around the macroeconomy and around political stability. But I hopefully that will right itself. And in fact, what I said earlier, much more worried about macroeconomic instability than I am about the political situation there.
Interesting. And before I ask you about Ukraine, so I do want to translate some of this experience and wisdom into what you think about Ukraine. But before I do that, what about Europe? I mean, we've heard the president say earlier that Ukrainians are optimistic about Europe. I'm curious, when you look at the European economy, are you optimistic about that? Or do you think that the sort of slow growth trajectory we've seen is going to stay, and politics could end up impeding some of the potential?
Well, let me say a fun story, and then I'll try to answer your question directly. But every year we have our Global Investor Summit in New York in April, and we always ask our investors, we do a poll, an electronic poll, which country, which part of the world are you most excited about in terms of generating investment returns in the year ahead? And every year Europe comes out at the bottom. It's always China, Brazil, US, India. Yet we've continued to find great opportunities in Europe, and it's represented 20 to 25% of our portfolio for a long time. And I think there's a few good reasons. Back to what I said, rule of law. It's a very investable geography. It has a highly educated population that does innovate. Maybe not at the scale that we see in places like China, Israel, or the US, but it does innovate. And we have found good entrepreneurship. As well. So, in fact, one of our most successful investments is a credit card processing company called Adyen, which is a Dutch company, global leader, serves Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, and it was founded by some entrepreneurs out of Amsterdam, and so we do find good opportunity even in Europe. So I'm an optimist there too.
Right, interesting. So, given your thoughts about the world's economic opportunities right now and this incredible digital disruption, when an investor like you looks at Ukraine, I'm curious to see what you make of it. I mean, do you have any investments in Ukraine at the moment?
We don't have them right now, but we are evaluating one in the IT services space.
Right.
And so I think Ukraine is got many of the building blocks we talked about in place. I was very encouraged by the president's comments this morning, particularly around judiciary reform and attacking corruption. Those are the kind of actions that really instill confidence among global investors. But you have really, as a legacy of the country's history, very strong academic capability in the STEM area, science and math and engineering, and that will no doubt create a base of talent to create new businesses. And I think I expect we'll see entrepreneurship in that area in the years ahead. It's also a large consumer economy. It's a relatively large population, good consumption area. So I think tech and consumer will be good opportunities in the Ukraine.
And what about both the physical safety aspect, security aspect, and also the question of monetary stability? I mean, if you were in a position of, advising the central bank right now, do you think they have the framework in place?
I think lately they've been doing the right things. I mean, I think we've had a good period for the Ukraine in terms of macroeconomic stability and good central banking. That's been a positive and quite encouraging. I mean, obviously, any investor would have to be worried about the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And I leaned over and asked the president's chief of staff when he said 45,000 troops in eastern the Ukraine. I apologize to Victor for not knowing off the top of my head it was that large. But, I mean, that is a concerning fact. It hasn't spilled over into the broader economy. 3% growth is obviously quite attractive. So I still think it's an investable economy and one that we've got our eye on.
Right. And where would you see as the main rivals to the Ukraine in terms of investment right now? I mean, are you comparing it to, say, the rest of Eastern Europe, or would you be comparing it to other emerging market locations?
Well, I think a lot of our investing activity is directed at technology, financial services, healthcare, and the consumer. And in the area we've really got our focus on it is IT services and technology. And you see a lot of global companies wanting to diversify away from India as a primary source for IT services. And a lot of it has been shifting towards Europe because of the technical talent and because of the time zone advantage. And some of the countries that seem to be winning are Romania, the Ukraine, and also the Estonia and those countries up in that area.
Right.
And so I think the Ukraine can really compete to occupy that position. Again, Romania has been done quite well as an outsourcing center.
Right. Well, I must say that's fascinating. So when you look across the world today and you look at the digital transformation, the rising excitement about big data, we were chatting earlier about the demographic shift and the move from the developed markets to the emerging markets in terms of economic power. And you were talking earlier about this rise of the middle class. What keeps you awake at night? What makes you worry that this picture of economic growth could go wrong?
I think that governments dealing with some of these urgent problems, you think about some big things that are happening, urbanization, resource utilization as the world becomes more prosperous and grows in size. These are significant issues. Immigration, I mean, 65 million displaced people around the world. These are issues that are not really being effectively addressed, and I think they're going to need to be to allow for this kind of economic growth to continue. And it worries me. Obviously, beyond that, the issues around geopolitical mistakes, like I said before. But just if I could say one more thing, Gillian, about technology. And I really liked what Neil said about nothing is static in technology. And people start making these prognostications around a static view. And a few things that are happening. I mean, if you look back at the last 10, 20 years and where the innovation came from, innovation came largely around the internet and global connectivity to where we've gotten to today, 2.5 million people connected to the internet, mostly through mobile devices. And that's been created a tremendous base of opportunity. That being one area. We're shifting to this era, excuse me for a second, this era of data and AI and machine learning. And you'll see a whole series of innovation that's going to take place around that I think will be quite interesting. And then something that I think we'll hear about later on from Vitaly Buterin is this idea of the Web 3.0, which is going to really be the challenge to Web 2.0. 2.0 meaning this consolidation of power among Google, Facebook, and those centralized powers could be completely redistributed by what's happening with crypto and blockchain.
Interesting. So you go from the centralization to the decentralization again, or rather.
Internet 3.0 will be wholly decentralized again and will spur a whole new chapter of innovation that could go on for a while.
Do you worry, though, that the internet could turn into what's called the splinternet, in the sense that you have different national regimes or different parts of the world that begin to put up barriers to the globally connected internet? Because so much of the investment thesis that drives groups like you and others today is predicated on the assumption that we have a coordinated, integrated internet. Do you worry about the splinternet?
Not as much, candidly. I think even if with a new generation of internet competitors around Web 3.0, I think we'll want to access a global market. There's just so much incentive to do that. So and the world wants to communicate. So I'm not as worried. What I am worried about, and this is ties into one of our sessions later today, is this whole issue of election meddling via technology. And Victor and I had a great conversation this morning, and I told him that if you look at the top Facebook countries, the top 5 are all democracies. The largest Facebook country in the world, the United States is number 2. The number 1 is India, democracy. U.S. number 2, 270 million people on Facebook in India, 220 in the United States. Third, Brazil, about 200.
Yeah.
And you go right down the list. So all the countries that are important large-scale democracies are also completely wired and connected. And if you think about what happened with the U.S. election via social media, it could happen. It could happen in the Brazil election, which will be later this year. In the Indian election next year, we saw it happen this year in a number of the elections in Europe. That gives me quite a bit of concern because it's systemic and very hard, very difficult to deal with.
To deal with, yes. Last quick question. We're just about out of time. Very quickly, given that you are such an experienced investor, given that you look around the world, look at the big themes, if you had any top tips for any of this audience about one place that you think people should invest now and one thing they should absolutely not invest under any circumstances, what would that be?
Oh, God, that's really hard. Okay, I'm not sure it would qualify as a tip. I think the next big sphere of innovation is going to be in biology and life sciences. I think the genomic revolution that began 15 years ago is beginning to yield tremendous new therapeutic breakthroughs. And I think a young person thinking about the next 25 years of investing, just like the last 25 was more about information technology, I think the next 25 years, some of the most exciting stuff will happen in human biology and life sciences.
Okay, so get excited about bioscience. And what would you not touch under any circumstance? And don't say what the last time I asked anyone that question, they turned around and said to me, the one thing I would never invest in is newspapers.
I promise I won't say that.
Well, you might feel that, but anyway.
I have a contrarian view. I think information is more valuable than ever, and so I don't have the...
Well, I love you already. But what would you not invest in under any circumstances?
I think it's more country-based. I mean, there's certain countries that I feel are, really where the rule of law is not there, and I think exposing capital to those places is extremely risky. And,
anywhere in particular?
Without naming names, I mean...
Well, please do name names. I'm sure the audience would love to know.
I think Russia is, I mean, I don't get in trouble with Russian people here, but, I really believe it because why has that country not been able to transform itself? Tremendous human capital, large country, and it has not been able to transform itself from being a commodity-driven, and not really even tried to transform itself into a commodity-driven economy and not respected the rule of law. And I think that's a place where, despite a lot of human capital there, we just won't expose our capital to. And
anywhere else?
Well, I could go on. Venezuela. I mean, we could go down the list, but they're all places that are often commodity-producing countries that have relied on commodity wealth. That's been a source of corruption and centralization of economic power.
Right.
That have really closed off investment opportunities and closed off entrepreneurship.
Right.
And so.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your candid answers, and best of luck in figuring out where to find some exciting bioscience opportunities.
Great.
So
thank you, Gillian. Thanks as always. Thank you.